Hey everybody, welcome to a video on shadow work. So for those of you who've been following along for the last month, the whole month of October has been dedicated to shadow work. We're coming up to Halloween, so I'm excited to finally bring out a video that's just encompassing it all. And we can start to really unpack the whole concept of what the shadow is, how it expresses itself. So this video is for you if you are noticing things like you're triggered by people. People are annoying the hell out of you. Are experiencing a lot of self-hatred or self-animosity. You're experiencing a lot of loneliness. You're experiencing a low self-worth. These are all things that the shadow gets in the way of you developing. Connection to other helps alleviate loneliness, these sorts of things, okay? So if you're experiencing any of these things, or you're just somebody who's really conscious and you're wanting to know a bit more about shadow work and diving into the aspects of the shadow, I might have some interesting points in this video that are gonna help point you in the right direction of doing your own shadow work. So let's start off by just talking a bit about what is shadow work. So for people who are not familiar with this concept, it's actually a term coined by Carl Jung in Jungian psychology, something I'm quite versed in from my background. And the shadow basically, well, if you think about it, we have three aspects of ourselves. We have these three structures, and one of them is the shadow structure, one of them is the ego structure, and the other one would be the authentic self structure, and it kind of is in the middle. And then we have the ego above, we have the shadow self below. The difference between the ego and the shadow self is one we are conscious of, being the ego, and one we are unconscious of, being the shadow. And we actually develop our ego structure to help us keep ourselves in denial of these shadow aspects of ourselves. So they're called shadows for a reason, because they aren't aspects that we're familiar with. They aren't aspects that we resonate with. So what we want to do is we want to learn to take these shadows out of the darkness and into the light, so we can bring more consciousness into our being. So shadow work is essentially learning to integrate or make peace with the parts of ourselves that we've split off or rejected from. And a lot of these things are things that resonate in the collective unconscious. So things like violence, sex, promiscuity, anything that we see as undesirable, being jealous, experiencing anger or rage. There's a lot of these things, right? We don't want to be seen as the darkness of our characters, so we bury it, and we use the ego structure to show the world our beautiful masks and how put together we are, and we create a discord between us and our authentic self. And that's all the work that I do. I want to help people clear the shadow, bring awareness to the ego, and integrate into one being, where we allow our shadow, we allow our light to come into harmony. And that means that we get to bring forth the aspects of ourselves that we hide or have hidden our whole lives. And that's when things start to really shift. That's when we develop connection and relatability, and we can practice vulnerability, and all these things start to happen in our lives, where we really just feel so much acceptance and so much love for ourselves and for others, and we allow people to provide that for us as well. So shadow work is all about this. It's about integration. So I'm really excited to be able to teach on this topic. It is one of the most painful yet most beautiful things I've ever done, is my own personal shadow work. And I'm still doing it, because shadow work takes time, and it takes safety and space, and a lot of courage and integrity. So all these things are virtues that I'm practicing currently. So I'm walking this path with you. I am not an expert in it by any means, other than my own personal experience. I'm an expert in my own personal experience with shadow work. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you here and join me in on this. So when you think about how to identify what our shadows are, because a lot of us don't really know what our shadows are. And the thing about shadows is they're so sneaky, and they're so good at staying hidden. But there is one backdoor way that tends to be really effective in discovering what our shadows are, and that is going to be through our triggers. Okay, so when people bother us, they trigger us. Oftentimes it's going to be a trigger response based off of something that we have yet to make peace within ourselves. So it might be something like we really don't like when people tell us what to do. Okay. An integrated or an unintegrated shadow is going to become triggered by that, because we might feel like, who is this person to tell us, how to live our lives, when, and it brings up this emotional response. And then what we can do is we can work backwards from this emotional response, and we can start to look at, what is it about this person, first off, that triggered me? What is it about this person's actions that triggered me? And start to kind of just get curious. Get curious and look within. And I think one of the biggest barriers to us being curious is we judge, right? We're not leading with curiosity, we're leading with judgment. And when we lead with judgment, we end up inciting shame on ourselves. We bring forth shame, and then when we feel shame, we want to shut down shop. We don't want to experience it anymore. So leading with curiosity is a big part of this work, and getting curious about your inner process is a big part of this work. So when we look at how to use our shadows, or how to use our triggers to understand our shadows, we need to make sure that we're looking at other people as not the enemy, but yet people are always just mirroring to us what we need to see within ourselves. So if we start to not reject people and judge people for the feelings they bring up in us, and we start to get curious about those feelings, we therefore start to bring light into the shadow aspects of ourselves, and we can start to soften, and we can start to feel into what is about this person that brought this up for me. And at that point, it no longer becomes about the person that triggered you, it becomes about the trigger itself within you, the feelings that it's bringing up for you, and that way we can start to unpack this stuff. Okay, so triggers, there's always treasure in the trigger, because that is our gateway to freedom. Although in the moment it sure as hell doesn't feel like that, because when we're all hyped up and we're feeling triggered by somebody, the last thing we want to do is soften, and the last thing we want to do is maybe admit that we're wrong, or that there's parts of ourselves that we're not willing to see and sit with. So that's why this work takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of creating a safe space for yourself to feel these feelings, these intense feelings that can come up by doing shadow work. So when you look at what it is that the shadow needs, okay? The shadow needs things to stay in darkness, but it also needs things in order to come into the light. And in order for our shadows to stay in the darkness, it needs secrecy, right? Just like shame. Shame needs secrecy to stay shameful. As soon as we bring shame out of secrecy, it allows for connection, and connection is where we heal our shame. So shadows are no different, because they often are rooted in shame. So in order for us to bring our shadows out of secrecy and out of darkness, we need to be willing to bring them into the light with safety, and understanding what it is that these needs that the shadow has, so we can start to meet these needs. Our shadows become shadows because they're needs that went unmet for us when we were younger, and often in our childhood. So we develop these maladaptive ways to try and get these needs met, and we end up doing it in dysfunctional ways that we feel shame about, and we therefore hide the fact that these things are dysfunctional, but yet they are meeting our needs in certain dysfunctional ways. So we choose to tune them out, and we choose to continue engaging in the behavior, but looking at it through our rationalizations, through denial, through projection, and keeping ourselves safe within the container of the shadow, not having to experience it. And that's where the ego comes into play, right? The ego justifies, the ego rationalizes, the ego projects, the ego denies. All of these psychological mechanisms that we use to keep the shadow in the darkness. So if we really want to get at the meat of the shadow, we need to stop engaging in these psychological defenses that we're using through the ego to prevent us from experiencing our shadow, because we need to experience our shadow in order to integrate it. So the shadow needs to have its needs met. That's the biggest thing. So what we can do is when we look at these triggers, for example, so I'm going to use some of my personal examples here, because I think this is important. I've been doing a ton of shadow work, and I've identified some key things about my own personal shadow that come up for me, and I'll just list them here. So my shadow likes to be right. It likes playing the victim to get attention and sympathy. It likes to be seen as hard done by. It likes to prove to others how valuable I am. It likes to compete to validate my pride. It compensates my inferiority as superiority. It role plays fights so he can prove how right he is. And I laugh because when I'm in my shadow, it's like, it's not funny. But when I'm in my higher self, it's hilarious to me that we play out these patterns. And so what I've done is I've backtracked. Okay, look at all these things. What are these flavors? What's the main flavors here that I'm working with? And it's the need to be right. It's the need to prove myself as worthy. It's playing the victim. It's compensation. Validation, all of these things. Okay, and I'm looking, okay, I'm going to backtrack. What need for me went unmet as a child? And there was a very big need that went unmet for me as a child, and it's not feeling heard and or understood as a child. I was an empath. I was very highly sensitive as a child, and I never felt like somebody got me, and I went through life just feeling very alone, very isolated in my experiences, and very scared. So I developed a callousness. I developed this ego mechanism to prevent me from having to experience that feeling of not being heard or not being understood. And I started to create this barrage of things around me to help me feel valid, to help me feel worthy, to help me feel all these things. But really what it did is it took me further and further away from my authenticity, because it was just manufactured things around me that I thought were meeting my needs, but really it was just pulling me away from my authentic self. And what I need, truly, and have always needed, is somebody to hear me, feel me, see me, and understand me in my authentic nature. And it isn't until I've experienced this very recent that I'm like, wow, like this feels so beautiful to finally let somebody in, let my walls down, and let somebody see me. And this has only been able to take place because of my integration of my shadows, because my shadows were what weren't letting me access this stuff. So the whole point of me sharing that was I want you guys to understand that how are we going about getting these needs met? Right? We need to undo the things we've learned to get these needs met, because it's like, for example, people that are sex addicted. I tend to attract a lot of these people into my work and or their partners, right? The partners of people who are sexually addicted, and a lot of it revolves around interpersonal connection. These people are looking for connection, but they don't know how to do it because the shadow self is too large, the authentic self is too small. So they're connecting with people in the only way that they know that makes them feel safe, which is through sex. So if we can learn to integrate shadow, we can learn to connect with people in deeper ways, because we don't feel shame for our shadow coming forward. And then we start to get connection, and then the sex addiction starts to release. And I always tell people, I'm like, the remedy or the cure to addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And that's when addiction heals, in connection, in community, in showing up and being seen. And when I say being seen, I mean being seen in your shadows, being seen in your light, being seen in your radiance and your beauty and everything, and our shortcomings. So they all get a place at the table, right? The mantra in shadow work is welcome everything. The mantra in authenticity work is welcome everything, right? It's always about welcoming everything, because we don't want to leave anything off the table, because then therefore we're shaming that part of ourselves. We're not allowing it a seat at the table, saying you're not worthy here. And that's us. We're talking to ourselves when we're in these states, right? So we want to really make sure that we're getting down to the root of this stuff, and we're allowing it to come and sit down at the table with us and unpack, because when it feels seen and it feels heard and it feels understood, it's like, oh, wow, you really, really get to experience life in a whole new way. So very important. I'm just looking at my trusty little notepad here. So shadow expression of meeting needs. So the shadow is going to always get excited and always want to rear its ugly head, we'll say, when needs go unmet, right? So when I have experiences that revolve around my unmet needs, so not feeling heard or understood. So if I'm ever in a group situation and I'm talking and people start talking over me, I immediately become triggered. And sometimes I'll get angry, but sometimes, most of the time, I'll probably just feel victimized. I'll feel like and then I'll just become silent, right? So it's this part of me that I really need to understand when it's stimulating something in me, And we need to catch ourselves in that moment. We need to listen to our body, right? Our body's always communicating to us. So when I have this feeling come up around not feeling heard, I immediately have a physiological response in my body. It's a wash. I get washed over with warm energy, and it just feels like heat, and it makes me either angry, like I said, or it makes me shut down. So I need to be really mindful of the physiological process, because my shadow is stored in my body, right? The shadow is always going to be stored in the body, in energy, in balls of energy that it can sometimes feel like tension. It sometimes feels like constriction. And when we start to do authenticity work and shadow work, we start to feel expansion and possibility versus limitation and constriction, right? This is a big part of it. And how we do this work is we create safety, okay? The shadow will never come forward in an unsafe environment. So we need to find safe containers where we can bring forth our shadow and start to allow it to be seen, first off by us and then by others. And I always say, like, in this work, we want to make sure that we're not biting off more than we can chew. We want to make sure that we are creating a safe space for ourselves to show up, and knowing that it's okay if we don't feel safe, that we keep our masks on and we keep our walls up. That's totally okay. Don't feel like you need to hop in, right? This isn't the vulnerability Olympics. You don't need to be jumping in the deep end right away and showing everybody your shadows. It's not what it's about. It's about making sure you have a safe space to do this work, and allow your walls to come down at a pace that works for you, right? And we only will know this if we're connected to our body. So that's why it's really important to spend time in our body when we're doing shadow work, because it will always release from the body. We will cry, we will purge, we will, whatever. The body's always communicating to us. So it's really important to stay in the body's experience and allow things to move and shift, because it really is just energy that's trying to move and shift. So there's an important aspect about this work that oftentimes people will experience, and that's the denial of the shadow self. And what happens when we deny our shadow selves, which is our desires, which is our needs being met, the shadow only gets louder and uglier and meaner, and it feels the need to belittle people. And you look at our world today and you look at people who are just so mean and so hateful, and how did they become this way, I ask myself. And oftentimes we become this way because we aren't giving our shadow permission to be, right? We're denying it a seat at the table. And then what happens is it creates this response inside of us that is rage and anger. And because we're always feeling divisive and like split and separated from ourself. And when we're split and divisive and separated from ourself, we are always going to be split, divisive, and separated from other. And that's where we lack connection. And that's where we never feel safe to put ourselves out there. And the whole human experience for us is meant to be about connection and showing up. So you wonder why we live in such a lonely world, because people can't feel safe. They don't feel safe to bring forward their shadow because they're denying the very existence of their shadow. So when we start to be able to heal and integrate, it really does give us an opportunity for a whole new way of relating to others and to ourselves. And a lot of the work that I do in my coaching is teaching people how to have a different relationship with themselves. We work with other to understand self in some of the work we do, but a lot of it is understanding self so we can work with other, right? We want to make sure that we know ourselves and we know what it looks like to create a safe container within ourselves. So therefore, when we go out into the world and we're interacting with people and relating with people, we know our parameters, we know our boundaries, we know not to deny parts of ourselves from having a voice. And that's when everything really starts to shift, and that's when people start to step into their authenticity. And it's through alignment of darkness and light, through shadow and consciousness. They come together and they get to be part of the experience together. And then what ends up happening is the shadow has a lot less power because it feels heard, right? Just like any other negative emotion we experience in this life, one of the hardest emotions for me to experience is jealousy. I do not like a jealousy. It is not a good one for me. I hate that feeling. It's horrible. But when I feel that feeling, I give it power and I give it permission to be, right? It's like jealousy comes knocking at my door and I can choose to just put up a barrier and not experience it. It just knocks louder and louder and louder. That's all that happens. We bring resistance up to something and it persists. So what I've been practicing is allowing the jealousy, and I open the door. allow it in, give it the power that it wants, which is to be heard and felt. And then once it's felt, it's gone. It releases itself. But it's the barriers and the walls we put up to these feelings and the self-judgment that we have towards these feelings that keeps it encapsulated inside of us and keeps our shadows growing and growing and growing. Okay? So the biggest question in this work, the biggest question I get a lot, okay, how do we integrate these shadows then? So we can feel more acceptance and more alignment to ourselves. There's so many strategies. There's no right or wrong way to do this. I want to be very, very forthcoming with that, as there is no right or wrong way to do this. You can allow people to trigger the shit out of you until you naturally evolve. You can start to go inside and do the work. You can hire a coach. There's so many ways that you can tackle the shadow, right? But there's going to be no more effective way than just love. Use love. Love is the ultimate transmuter. It transmutes everything. So when we start to bring love versus fear and judgment to our shadow, it just softens. And the shadow feels like it has space to finally exist within you. And it integrates, it moves from shadow into ego, and then ego is conscious so we can work with it, and then it moves from ego into integrated self and authentic self, and we get to work with it here too, which is even more conscious. And it doesn't mean that these aspects of ourselves just dissolve. No, they stay with us because they're part of who we are. But when we start to allow them to be a part of who we are, we stop judging them. And suddenly the horrible, big, monstrous thing that we thought about ourselves becomes just a part of us. And we celebrate it, and we laugh at it when we bring it forward with people, because it's actually quite humorous when we integrate something, when we look back on, oh my God, I can't believe I carried so much shame and hatred toward myself about something so silly. You know what I mean? Like there's not, the only reason why it's so intense is because it's hiding in the darkness, and it's an unknown to us. As soon as we make it known, it becomes a lot more safe. So one of the things that, the two main things that the ego uses to keep the shadow in the darkness is projection and denial. So projection is this experience of, I see somebody outside myself engaging in thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that I don't like about myself either. And instead of sitting with the myself, I talk about the other. So for example, things I experienced when I was growing up gay and not being authentic with that experience is when I would see gay people, I would become like, I would make fun of them, or I would, it would make me really uncomfortable, and then I would project that this is them. It has nothing to do with me. And projection is probably one of the most common things that we use as a society to divide ourselves from each other. Because if I was integrated that shadow around being gay, I would invite that person in. I would love them. I would see the love I have for self, and it would make me want to love other. And that's the work. That's what happens when you do shadow work, is you actually get to love more, because you're no longer seeing people as separate than you. You're seeing them as the same as you, because we all have these parts of ourselves that we're split from. So that's projection. Denial, obviously, is we use the ego to deny any sort of connection to our shadow, or to the things that we don't want to be seen as. So for the longest time, I would use things around not feeling heard or not feeling understood, is I wouldn't put myself in situations where I would need to feel heard or understood. I became controlling, and I would be the one with the loudest voice. So I used, in some aspects, aggression as a way to not have to experience the inferiority that my shadow was causing me. So we have to look at it like, okay, what am I trying to prevent myself from experiencing, so I don't have to sit with these parts of myself that I've rejected. And then once we bring things from shadow into ego, we can start to set boundaries with our ego, because we're conscious of it. We can't set boundaries with our shadow because we're not conscious of it. We don't even know it exists. So what we need to do is we need to do shadow work, start exposing our these parts of ourselves through self-disclosure, self-exposure. And when we do that, it moves from shadow into ego, and then we can start to set boundaries with it. And what that might look like is when these triggers come up for me, so the desire to need to be right all the time, well, what does it feel like to be wrong? Right? What does it feel like to allow somebody else to be right without me having to be wrong? Can we both be right? Can we both exist in our truth? That's me meeting my ego and saying, okay, I understand that you have this experience of needing to be right. However, right? It's the however. The however is setting a boundary with your ego. It's challenging yourself, saying, is there a possibility that a part of me is feeling this emotionally reactive because I'm trying to hide something about myself? I'm trying not to experience these things about myself. Get curious, right? We set boundaries with ourselves when we lead through from curiosity, right? And then when we find something and we're just curious about it, we can say, well, maybe, right? Maybe whatever that looks like for you, X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank. Maybe I'm, doing this to prevent myself from having to feel wrong or for having to feel whatever. So there is no, like I said, there's no right or wrong way to do this work. If you're feeling like you need some guidance in this area, I would recommend just reaching out. We can set up a consult. We can talk about some of this stuff and start to do the integration of shadow, start to explore the shadow, start to look at what that looks like. And I promise you, like, this work, when it's done, it's your life, everything changes because you're no longer scared. You're no longer living in fear. You make more space in your being for authenticity, love, abundance, joy, confidence, all of these things when you clear the shadow, because the shadow is taking up so much space inside of your being, inside of your psyche. Everything is just inundated with shadow. So when we integrate them, just think of all the space that's made in your being to invite all of really what you want more of in this life to embody. And that's when life gets really fun and interesting. So if this is an area that you're interested in, but you're not quite sure where to start, definitely reach out to me and we can set up a consult and look at doing some coaching, okay? Hopefully that helps. Please leave your comments below. I would love to know a little bit about where you're at in your shadow work journey. If you've done it, if you haven't, what are you scared of? Like, just share your thoughts and feelings with me. It's really cool. I love when people engage with my work. It makes me feel good when people are using the content I'm creating to heal and to bring more consciousness into their lives, because I know another conscious mind brings another conscious mind into this world, because we spread. The more consciousness we have in this world, we spread it, and it's infectious. So let your beautiful light shine and lead with a lot of curiosity and see what comes up. All right, have a beautiful day, guys. Thanks for tuning in.